Bienvenue à Kingsbrae Gardens. If I could ask you to please rise as members of Royal Canadian Legion Branch Number 8, march on the colors! If you'd please remain standing, we'll call Nation Alfred to the stage to guide us in the singing of our national anthem, a student at Sir James Dunn Academy here in St. Andrews.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north strong and free. From far and wide, oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Thank you. You can take your seats, and the music started early, as you can hear. It's good to be here in Pescotu Mukati territory in the Great Wabanaki Confederacy, for their warriors have served within the Canadian Armed Forces for over a century in the common effort to protect our lands and peoples. And today, this small event before the festivities kick off is about recognizing those who serve and those who have served to defend our homes and our nation. That's what today's gathering is about. In addition to hearing magnificent music in a beautiful place to celebrate Canada and all of its peoples. Thanks, we must say, to Mayor Brad Henderson, a tireless advocate and enabler for this town that's a great jewel in our beautiful province. He is an energy force that has helped put today's concert together. Mayor Brad. And for those of you who don't know, the Grand General of Kingsbrae Garden, Dr. Lucinda Flamer, we must thank her too for creating and constantly growing this teaching garden and enabling this musical celebration to happen on this very special day of days. Some of you may not know that she raised her own military family and is a passionate advocate for Canadian veterans. Indeed, the Peace Garden here at Kingsbrae was created as a living tribute and a quiet place to gather and reflect and remember. Of course, 11th of November is the day that we pause to remember those who lost their lives in wartime. So today we're going to focus on recognizing the service of all of those who have come home. We wish to recognize all members and veterans of the Canadian Armed Forces who swore the sacred oath to protect this place and its people and to make the world a more peaceful and secure place. This has been a central mission at Kingsbrae Gardens, quietly and gathering momentum over many years. And before I go any further, I would like to call upon my friend, Lieutenant Colonel Howard Flood, a Sandhurst graduate, a Grenadier Guardsman, Queen's Own Rifles paratrooper, and former commanding officer of the Royal Regiment of Canada, to say a few words about how this particular moment has come to be.
I'm afraid, being an old inventor from the parade square, we like talking on the microphone.
Can't hear you.
You can't? Gosh, well, I have to speak louder. Does that work for you? Put your heels together. Right. What I'd like to briefly talk about is, for 25 years or so, we have tried to recognize and give homage to veterans, also to those who did not come back. As you're probably aware, since Confederation, over 117,000 Canadians did not come home. To commemorate those 158 young Canadians who recently went to Afghanistan and did not come home, you will see their poppies over there by that tree. So we try to maintain and recognize not only those who didn't come back, but we need to support and recognize those who did come back and do need your help, and our recognition. A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to be tasked to look after a group of veterans. One of those veterans was actually a very humbling experience. We soldiers tend to look at each other's medals and compare, sometimes with envy. And there's this one chap, James Stewart, who had a wonderful collection of medals, but most importantly, he had a caterpillar on his tie, a golden caterpillar. He had a goldfish on his tie. These are both rather exclusive clubs. To have the goldfish means that you actually landed in the ocean and somehow survived. James Stewart took off in a hurricane on a one-way mission to discourage 2 German bombers from attacking a convoy. He survived. Being a glutton for punishment, maybe because he's Scottish, he learned how to fly Typhoons. And he was spending time over Normandy in 1944, a bit of a sport, shooting up German freight trains. Mind you, that Jerry didn't like that and shot him down. He escaped, but got caught in July 1944 in Paris. The Jerrys didn't take to him very well, so they put him in a concentration camp. Yet he managed to persuade his captors to put him in a normal camp. He came to this part of the world, worked for Connolly's. He was the most modest man, but he was a hero in our midst. Thanks to James, it inspired us to create a program called Hero in Our Midst. There are heroes next to you, amongst us, who we don't recognize. So here at Kingsbury, we have decided that on an annual basis, we will try and identify, and thanks to you, we rely on your input, to identify someone who's gone beyond and is a hero in our midst. So today, we will be recognizing 2 individuals who are indeed heroes on our midst, and I'll leave it to my learned colleague to do the further introduction. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Mesdames et messieurs, forgive me, my name is Lee Windsor. I come from the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society at the University of New Brunswick, and I'm a good friend of Kingsbury Garden and a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces myself. As Colonel Flood indicated, since this is the first time we've been able to gather together in person since COVID, we have 2 tasks to recognize 2 heroes. And it's rather fitting that they span 70 years of military service between the 2 of them. We'll start off with our 2022 hero in our midst. As you all know, or maybe you don't, there are very precious few Second World War veterans still with us. But Flying Officer, and later Army Lieutenant Herb McGee, is still fit and happy and sitting right in front of me at 98 years of age. Oh, but you don't know the story yet. Herb's a Charlotte County boy. Means he's a bit of a scrapper. Born in St. Andrews right here in 1925. He's done the whole St. Andrews thing. He's been the shoe shine boy and the bellhop and the Algonquin. And then he went off to Montreal to work when he was still a teenager during the 30s, towards the end of Prohibition. And it was from there, he was only born in 1925, he only was old enough, not even really old enough, to join up for service in the Second World War in 1943, when the war's halfway along. And he's, as I said, he's underage, but he convinces the RCAF recruiters to let him in, partly so that they can convince him to take on the toughest assignment in the RCAF, and that being the tail gunner in a heavy 4-engine bomber. The war in 1943 was in its most brutal phase as casualties mounted in all 3 of Canada's armed forces, but the 2 hardest and most deadly years left ahead. Herb started his basic training in 1943 and went off for advanced aircrew training at Mount Pleasant in Prince Edward Island in a 2-seater ferry battle aircraft. Early in 1944, he completed his operational training unit service where he learned the finer points of being a tail gunner in a 4-engine Halifax heavy bomber. Now, at that point in the war, the heavy bomber force is employed to fight at night, baiting the German Air Force and the aircraft industry into battle to wear them down, to win air superiority before D-Day in Normandy, and then to support the battle for Normandy as it unfolded. It was also getting ready to fly missions directly in support of the Normandy invasion, and that meant learning to fly at low altitude with new radio navigation beacons to strike targets with a great deal of precision. Herb learned particularly how to be a key member of his crew to guard against the radar-equipped night fighters that would home in and attack the rear of Canadian and Commonwealth heavy bombers. Herb was the most critical defensive member of his crew, except, as I learned from him a few weeks ago, as a tail gunner, he's not really allowed to be part of the crew. In that summer of 1944, he was assigned to 434 Blue Nose Squadron, but tail gunners form a pool, and they're assigned to an aircraft on each mission because it was deemed too hard on the morale of the main crew of a heavy bomber to lose too many of their core team. And in night actions, tail gunners often got hit. So Herb learned to fly and to fight the furthest detached airman on his airplane, and yet still vital to protect the lives of everyone else in the crew. He joined his squadron on operational service at the height of the Battle of Normandy. At the same moment that the German V-1 cruise missiles were striking British cities in the peak of that period, not unlike we see Russian cruise missiles striking Ukrainian cities today. So his first missions in 1944 were launched against those cruise missile launch pads and storage sites in that bitter summer. Herb's flight logbook reflects the way that the whole of the Royal Canadian Air Force Heavy Bomber Force served in that climactic period of the Second World War. Among his first missions of the war was part of the transportation plan to hit German fuel dumps and French transportation nodes, to slow the rate at which German troops could arrive in the Normandy battlefield. In order to do this, they had to fly low. They had to fly 6,000 to 7,000 feet above the surface of the earth, which made them tremendously vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, and therefore the losses were high. Not long into his operational tour of service, Herb flew on V-1 launch sites very closely located to French villages, which also necessitated flying low in a vulnerable state in order to spare the lives of innocent French civilians and strike the target with precision. On the 14th of August 1944, Herb participated in the famous 1st Canadian Army attack on Falaise, an attack that saw the Canadian Heavy Bomber Force employed directly in support of the Army. They knew again that flying low and taking German flak was the key to hitting the right targets and not striking their own men. So they took the risk and accepted the losses. After the Battle of Falaise, Herb's squadron helped the Canadian Army break out from Normandy, along through the heaviest coastal defenses of the Atlantic Wall. Again, he flew at low level through the bombardment to break German fortress positions at the great port of Le Havre and against the Atlantic Wall gun positions protecting Calais and Boulogne and Cap Grenay in the narrowest part of the English Channel. Herb struck the most powerful coastal defenses on the planet, rattling their cages while Canadian infantrymen and tankers could close with and attack them and destroy them on the ground. After the Battle of Normandy, Herb participated in the strikes against the Ruhr, the German industrial heart. And when his combat tour ended in late 1944, he was able to come home. He spent some time recovering in the Lancaster St. John Military Hospital, recovering from some injuries sustained in service. And as painful as Herb's ear and jaw injuries were, he was more mobile than many of the Army the Italian campaign veterans in the ward that he shared with, who were missing limbs. And so, Herb organized a party for them, securing rum and other key maritime party supplies. Herb's party and his service to his fellow veterans that night was an enormous hit with the soldiers in his ward. And the loud singing late at night drew the attention of a very stern-faced Nurse Colic, or the Dragon Lady, as Herb called her. Well, she turned out to be not that stern, because Herb married her. It's Bev's mom. In the last months of the war, Herb was commissioned as a flying officer, and in the last year he worked in the training system in Moncton in the Okanagan Valley that he fell in love with and later moved to. Like the majority of First and Second World War veterans, Herb came home, as Colonel Flood was mentioning earlier. He came home alive to a hero's welcome, especially to his proud father. At the end of the war in 1945, he released to the RCAF Reserve, but he signed up again during the Korean War to participate in the Royal Canadian Army Service Corps, this time as a lieutenant in the Army. The war ended before he was able to go over, but nonetheless, he stood up willing to serve. After Korea, he went on to work in Montreal and also in Kelowna before moving back here to St. Andrews to buy his aunt's old house on Water Street, where he lives with his daughter, Bev, and his son-in-law. Or, as many of you in St. Andrews know, they live at Diesel's house on Water Street. I wasn't quite sure why exactly he was awarded as a Knight of the Légion d'Honneur, as a member of a bomber crew, but after getting to speak with him a few weeks ago and understanding that he flew all of his missions at the height of the battle for Normandy and the liberation of France, I now understand why the French government has honored him in this way. He's been an able member of all the communities he's lived in and still remains an active member of our St. Andrews community today. And therefore, we wish to acknowledge him as a hero in our midst for 2022. Lieutenant McGee. Barb's daughter, Bev, will say a few words on his behalf.
I would like to say myself a speech, but I sometimes forget where I'm going. So I'm going to turn it over to my daughter, Bev. Thank you very much.
Do you need to sit down, or are you okay? Hello, I'm Bev Mayer, Herb McGree's only child, and my father has asked me to speak on his behalf. He first wants me to give each of you a big hug. To Mrs. Flamer and His Worship Mayor Brad Henderson, my father thanks you for organizing this recognition of veterans, and he appreciates the work you've done and are doing toward remembering the veteran and democracy. To Lee Windsor, thank you for keeping history alive and your remarkable words about my father. Your in-depth research unearthed parts of my father's war story that I never knew. Although Dad is an amazing storyteller, there are many war details still too raw to share. Congrats also to the fellow recipient, Trapper Crane. Your story and continued work with veterans is remarkable, and ride on. Dad accepts today's honor on behalf of his many comrades who gave us the freedom we all enjoy today. A few notables he's listed are his cousin, Joe Gibson, Stubby Thomas, Splinter Stinson, John Rogers, Johnny Lyons, Skiff Parker, Bob Tennant, Ray and Herman Bartlett, and Charlie Rooney. Today is Father's fourth hug of honors, dating back to 1945 when he returned from No. 6 Bomber Command. He arrived by train to St. Andrews and was met by his father, Hazen McGee. Dad asked, "Where is your car? I have 2 heavy kit bags." Hazen grabbed my dad and hugged him tight. My dad has said it was the first and longest hug of his life. Then Hazen and he grabbed arms, and they walked up the center of Water Street all the way home to Edward. The second hug of honors, Dad says, was when he was given the Quilt of Valor in 2021. And his third hug of honor was in 2022 when he received his knighthood from France. Thanks again. Thanks again for the fourth hug of honor today. Congratulations, Dad. You are amazing. And I have never been prouder. Mom would have been thrilled, and I know she is watching. You're only 98, but I know the best is yet to come. Love you, and hugs to everyone.
Next in the order of proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge Paul Trapper Kane. He's no stranger to many of you. He's from Cobourg, Ontario. But we won't hold that against him because he spent much time in his youth in Charlotte County and chose to settle here after he retired from the Canadian Armed Forces. He joined up in 1976. It was a different era to serve in the Canadian Armed Forces in those days. The Cold War was heating up again in the late 1970s as the Soviet Union and NATO developed new nuclear weapons capabilities, and the Soviets maintained a massive, heavily armed force of conscripts from all over Asia and Eastern Europe. In those days, much like today, the Canadian Armed Forces' job was twofold: to stand ready with our NATO allies to provide flexible options in case the Soviets launched a rapid invasion. And the other part of the mission was to keep the peace in dozens of small wars, to prevent them from escalating and turning into a grand nuclear conflagration. Trapper served on both of those assignments. First, he packed off to basic training in Cornwallis, and from there he shipped off to Wainwright, Alberta for infantry battle school, and on that tough course, Trapper stood out early and was recognized as the top candidate. After that, he was assigned to 3rd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry out in Victoria, British Columbia. A plum posting in the infantry, I must say. The envy of many. The Canadian Armed Forces regularly sends members on exchange with our NATO allies so that the whole multinational force can understand each other and work well together. And Trapper was picked to help with that effort. Only the best get picked for that. He was sent off the U.S. Army's Recondo School for long-range reconnaissance patrolling at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, at that time run by experienced Vietnam veterans. He also took the U.S. Army's Infantry Patrol Leaders course at Fort Lewis and again earned the Top Candidate Award. After that, Trapper was sent with a Canadian team to the Franco-German border to compete on the French Army Commando course, and his team won against teams from the French and British armies. He was being groomed as a senior non-commissioned officer, the long-time backbone of the Canadian Army. He was put through the paces on the infantry section commander's course and then through a tough package of courses designed to teach the knowledge and the skills necessary for promotion to be a sergeant in the Canadian infantry. Trapper became the type of soldier skilled at specialized light infantry, the most physically demanding work in our army. He's a qualified sniper, a mountain warfare instructor, and topped his course again on the advanced recce patrolman course and also at the Australian Jungle Warfare School. In 1980, Trapper put on a blue beret and deployed with the 3rd Battalion of the Patricias for a rotation on the UN peacekeeping mission in Cyprus. That tour was only a few years after the big Turkish invasion of '74 that redistributed the Greek and Turkish populations on that Mediterranean island, so the job of keeping things quiet was not easy. But that mission was critical. For those of you who don't know about it, the Cyprus conflict pitted Greece against Turkey, both NATO member states. The Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan the year before, and the Cold War was getting hot. It was critical for the UN force in Cyprus to keep a lid on the tension there and prevent an open war between Greece and Turkey that the Soviets might take advantage of and strike into southern Europe. Events recently make us realize how that's all too real a possibility. After his successful service in Cyprus, Trapper was posted to the elite reconnaissance platoon in 3rd Battalion. He rose to become the regimental sniper sergeant. Later on, this is most important in light of events today. In the early 1990s, he deployed with the 3rd Battalion of the Patricias to sail with the United States Marines, the United States Navy, and the Canadian Navy in the largest fleet exercise in the Pacific Ocean since the Second World War, Fleet X-83, 60 miles from the Russian border. It was a time of the 1983 war scare, the greatest war scare arguably since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and certainly the largest naval deployment we've seen in the second half of the 20th century. As always, the mission was to demonstrate military skill and capability to Soviet opponents to convince them that aggressive war was not an option, but to always be ready in case the Warsaw Pact chose it. If anything, it's preventative soldiering, preventative military service, a different kind of peace mission. During the 1980s, the threat of conventional war with the Soviets grew as both sides looked for non-nuclear military options in that conflict. Demonstrating that Canada and NATO could field superbly trained, well-equipped, and well-motivated forces in Europe was the key to deterring the Soviet Union from going to war, very similar to the way Canadian soldiers serve in Latvia today. As part of that effort, Trapper led his platoon through high readiness training in Canada, mountain warfare training across Europe to demonstrate that NATO had the capacity to guard the Alps and other mountainous places in Europe. And in that light, he transferred to the Canadian Airborne Regiment, the Patricia Commando, No. 2 Commando. And in that last intense period of the Cold War, the Airborne Regiment changed so that it could be a rapid response force to deploy to Norway or Denmark in a time of crisis. In that role, Trapper was posted to the Pathfinder Recce Platoon as the regimental sniper sergeant, the elite of the elite. By 1986, with 300 parajumps behind him, in November, during a jump exercise at 1,000 feet, a fellow paratrooper had become unconscious, collided with Trapper in midair, causing their chutes to wrap. Trapper cut away the fouled chute, saving the life of his comrade. But the act launched Trapper into a 180-foot free fall before he hit the frozen earth, cracking his spine and leg in multiple places. It took 2 years in hospital and 19 surgeries to recover, although his body would never be the same. His heart arguably got stronger. Sergeant Kane was released medically from the Canadian Armed Forces in 1988, the year I joined TRAP. A year later, the Berlin Wall came down, and the Cold War ended. You won your war, Sergeant Kane. You helped save the planet from nuclear annihilation. Like most Canadian veterans, Armed Forces veteran stories, Paul's didn't end when he left the Army. In order to help other veterans make the transition to civilian life, he co-founded the Canadian Army Veterans Motorcycle Units. The CAV, many of them who are here with us today, supports dozens of charities and has raised millions of dollars across Canada in support of a number of great charities. Many will remember also how the members of the CAV participated in every repatriation ceremony for every Canadian soldier and aircrew member that we lost in Afghanistan. Trapper himself attended 150 of those repatriations. He's also served with the Royal Canadian Legion. He's also served with the Royal Canadian Legion in St. Croix Branch No. 9 in St. Stephen to help it transform for a new millennium in support of new generations of veterans. He's given 35 years of faithful service to veterans and serving members since he left the Armed Forces. That second career earned him a Minister of Veterans Affairs commendation, the Meritorious Service Medal, and a range of other decorations. And it is for all these reasons, Sergeant Kane, you have been selected as this year's 2023 recipient of the Hero in Our Midst Award. Sergeant Kane!
Like my brother Howard, I spent years on a parade square, so this comes naturally to me. In fact, you should get your tax dollars worth. You spent a lot of money for me to be able to do this. My path took me here in I think a typical Canadian way. I opened my eyes as a youth and started to learn what gave me the freedoms I have around me. When I was a little fella, my grandmother, who I was raised as my grandmother, sent me upstairs to get some linen to cover the dining room table before Christmas dinner. I didn't realize until that point she was my grandfather's second wife. My blood grandmother, my first grandmother, was killed of all things picking blueberries. Charlotte County, that must happen a lot. I know eating them is taking time off my life. Her last words on this earth were, "Oh my God, the brakes are gone." So this woman who sent me to get this linen, I opened up the bottom drawer of the dresser and there was the linen and a memorial cross and a scroll that comes and a piece of parachute from a fellow who'd been killed in the Second World War, her first husband. That was the first time I was introduced to the Silver Cross, the memorial cross. My mother's people lost Sergeant Clyde Alexander Monroe, who was killed by a sniper on July 8, 1944, on the first day of Operation Charnwood, with my brother, Mr. McGee, flying air gunner above them. On my mother's side, that was a tragedy. They would never talk about Clyde's death. They wouldn't talk about what happened to him. I found out later he was killed by a sniper just on the edge of Biron. On my father's side, a fellow named Elwood Hyde, who was raised with those boys. He was my grandfather's sister's boy. He was killed at Osoro after they took that big ridge by the Hasty Peas. He was killed by a mortar round. So these 3 memorial crosses taught me that there's a cost to be paid. The other thing I tried to understand was every summer we would come here to St. Andrews for 2 weeks, and we'd always have the pleasure to stay out at the point. And I would ride my bicycle into town to get candy, just like I'm doing now, it turns out. In fact, in those days, I've been coming to Charlotte County, St. Andrews since I was in diapers. So now that I live here, I'm looking forward to the circle of life taking me right back to that point again. But to try to understand what those folks went through in the Second World War, my mother's side, they all drank. On my father's side, they apparently had what was called a good war. 3 of them brought home war brides. They got lumber yards, they got the construction, they lived their lives. But every time we would come here to St. Andrews for that 2 weeks, we would then go to Pictou County, where all those veterans of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders who'd had the 12th SS go through them like a buzzsaw on D-Day, they're the ones that drank. And I started to understand what a bad war was. So to truly understand it, I had to put on the uniform. Those 3 memorial crosses taught me how serious military service was. And as my brothers told us, I had a pretty good experience. Until one day, as a sniper, as the ultimate killing machine in the Canadian Forces, I had little empathy inside me. You don't need empathy when it's your job to put a bullet through someone's head at 1,000 yards. When I was in the hospital, I was paralyzed. It took 19 surgeries to bring me back to where I am now. And those spirits, those souls, those nurses, the staff, the medics, everybody who cared for me, every time they hooked me up to an IV, every time I went through surgery, they put empathy back into me. So all those memories I had before and all the experiences I had, I was on the road on a motorcycle, which I've always been drawn to. I met a young veteran who was a Bosnia veteran who'd just come back from the fighting in the Medak pocket. In the years since I created the organization at his side, we've moved into 64 cities across Canada. We were recognized by the Governor-General of Canada a few years ago at Rideau Hall by donating $7.5 million to charity. All things that started with a little fella on a bicycle right here in this town. This town, this community, this province, this country is sacred to me. All those folks who gave everything and never come back, they're standing by my side. Because what St. Andrews did for me was it gives me memories. It gave me memories which to an infantry soldier became ammunition. When I was overseas and things were hard, when things were really hard, I would always come back to those summers here in St. Andrews. I would always transport my back. If I was on top of the highest mountain in Europe, I climbed Monte Bianco, Mont Blanc in 1984. I couldn't help but compare the view on top of that mountain with St. Andrews. And all those experiences out there when the tide went out, making David Suzuki crazy by pulling stuff out of the tidal pools and drying them out. St. Andrews gave me beautiful, beautiful memories, and it became ammunition. As a soldier, retired and injured, helping out fellow veterans, I still came back to St. Andrews. And I would come here to Kingsbrae, Kira, which has now developed into this incredible energy we have right here, thanks to Lucinda, God love her, her family, Brad Henderson, all the staff that work here. I would keep coming back here, and as Colonel Flood mentioned, the Afghanistan tributes, I would then leave this area throughout the war years, and I would ride 19 times I've crossed Canada, Newfoundland, to British Columbia and back. And I would tell them, your son or daughter did not die in vain. There's a little community, St. Andrews, which puts on a ceremony every year. They have a garden in your son or daughter's name. This community healed hearts right across Canada. Trust me. Thank you for this recognition. It's humbling. It's certainly not in my mind deserved. But I want to thank you all for giving me another memory for ammunition. And my brother, Mr. McGee, you flew guns up my Uncle Clyde when he was on his last day. God love you, I do. Thank you all.
For all of you gathered here, Trapper reflects generations of Canadian veterans who have served in peace and war since 1945. There's actually 600,000 of them. And it is these new 3-4 generations of veterans that are now the heroes among us. If you are serving or have served in the Canadian Armed Forces, we'd ask you now to please stand. I know it's hard. Do it. Suck it up. Captain Golder. Thank you all. The musical portion of our program today will begin shortly. Just before that happens, I'd ask you to rise one more time as we march off the color. To your colors, people!